You've probably heard this story. I mean, it's pretty much etched into the cultural consciousness of half the planet.
Yeah, everyone knows some version of it.
Right. It's the lone man wandering in this freezing desert, a dark mountain, and, a burning bush that suddenly speaks.
Which is always depicted so theatrically.
Exactly. You've been told your entire life that it's this story about magic, about miracles, about this terrified mortal just, falling to his knees before a supernatural visitation.
Right.
But, well, what if we told you that reading it as a mystical fairy tale completely destroys the actual payload of the text? Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking your sources on a foundational narrative, specifically Surah Al-Qasas, verses 29 and 30.
And we are totally stripping away thousands of years of religious sentimentality and that mystical fairy dust.
We really are, because we're going to look at this not as a magic show, but as a hyper-rational masterclass in systems engineering and, civilizational survival.
Because it fundamentally changes the entire narrative when you drop the theological lens and pick up a socioeconomic one.
It's a total paradigm shift.
It really is.
Yeah.
I mean, we were looking at a text that is actively trying to explain how a governing rational system operates in the real world.
Right.
Like, how does a massive overarching intelligence recruit a human being? How does it brief them? And most importantly, how does it deploy that operational agent to completely dismantle a deeply exploitative ruling order?
Because it's an entrenched system they're going up against.
Exactly. This isn't about ghosts on a hill. It's a highly technical manual on the mechanics of societal change.
And to really grasp those mechanics, I think we have to start by completely resetting the physical and psychological stage.
Oh, absolutely.
We need to just, forget the cinematic versions we've all seen in movies. According to the source material, we are looking at a figure, Musa, or Moses, who is in a state of extreme physical and psychological depletion.
Yeah, he's totally drained.
He has just finished this grueling, decade-long labor contract in a region called Midian. And he's traveling with his family across an unforgiving landscape.
Let's talk about the reality of those conditions, too.
Yeah, please.
It's pitch black. The temperatures in that desert terrain, I mean, they drop to freezing at night. They are lost. Survival is not guaranteed at all.
It's a nightmare scenario.
It is. And in the middle of this high-stakes life-or-death pressure cooker, he spots a sudden anomaly on the dark slope of Mount Tur, a fire.
Which is, it's the ultimate psychological stress test.
Oh, for sure. How a human mind reacts to a sudden, unexplained anomaly in the dark, especially under extreme physical duress, well, it tells you everything you need to know about their cognitive framework.
Right.
If we look at the exact wording of Surah Al-Qasas, verse 29, the text goes out of its way to detail Musa's immediate tactical reaction, and it's entirely devoid of superstition.
And that's what completely upends the traditional narrative for me. Because, in every mythological story ever told, when the hero is alone in the dark and sees a mysterious light, the immediate reaction is primal fear.
Or superstitious awe. Yeah.
Right. They assume it's a paranormal apparition. Like, they assume it's a spirit, a demon, maybe a god playing tricks. But Musa's mind doesn't jump to the supernatural.
Not at all.
His instinct is purely operational. He tells his family to stay put, and he gives two highly specific, pragmatic reasons for moving toward the anomaly. He says, maybe I will bring you kabar from it, or a burning brand so you can warm yourselves.
You really have to look at the underlying logic of that statement, because he is facing a critical survival equation here.
His family is freezing, and they're lost.
Exactly. He needs thermal energy, or he needs intelligence, navigational data to get them out of the desert. So he treats the anomaly purely as a potential resource to solve a material problem.
Yeah.
He sees a physical phenomenon, and he expects a physical, practical outcome.
He's acting like a field operative. I think of him less like a trembling mystic and more like a modern scout or a radar operator who suddenly sees an unidentified blip on their screen.
That's a great analogy.
Right. Because the operator doesn't assume the blip is a ghost. They assume it's data.
Right. They assume there's a rational explanation.
Yeah, maybe a weather balloon, maybe another aircraft. And their immediate job is to investigate and extract actionable intelligence. Musa expects data, not a phantom.
Which forces us to ask why the text places such heavy emphasis on his pragmatism in this specific moment. Why not just say he saw a fire and walked up to it?
Right. Why add the detail about his reasoning?
Because the source material argues that this initial encounter functions as a preliminary credential check by the governing system. It is literally a cognitive stress test.
Okay, wow.
Before this overarching system can deploy him with a massive socioeconomic payload, it has to test his mental architecture.
So wait, I want to make sure I understand the mechanics of this credential check. Are you saying the system put the fire there specifically to see if he would freak out?
I am saying the system is looking for a very specific type of mind. The question embedded in the text is this: can this potential agent receive a signal, recognize it strictly as a signal, and act on it rationally without demanding that it be magical in order to be real?
Okay, I see.
Because if Musa had dropped to the ground, just paralyzed by superstitious terror, he would have failed the test instantly.
Right, because a mind that defaults to superstition in a crisis is, well, it's utterly useless for the mission he's about to be assigned.
It is worse than useless. It's a liability.
Yeah.
Think about the target he is eventually going to face. Pharaoh's entire systemic power relies heavily on superstition.
The whole God King thing.
Exactly. The illusion of his own divinity and the manipulation of the masses through irrational fear. You cannot send an agent to dismantle an empire built on magical thinking if that agent is himself prone to magical thinking.
Oh, that makes so much sense. To break Pharaoh's system, you need a mind that operates ruthlessly on evidence, cause, and effect.
And Musa proves he has that mind. He treats the unknown not as a source of terror, but as a source of data.
And because he treats it as a source of data, the system meets him on exactly that frequency.
Yes.
It doesn't respond with a theatrical spectacle or some cheap magic trick. It responds with structural communication.
It really does.
And if we dive into the linguistics of verse 30, the terminology the text uses is incredibly precise. I mean, it completely strips away any remaining mystical interpretations.
The Arabic terminology here is purely systemic. When Musa first spots the anomaly, the text uses the word nar. And while traditionally translated simply as fire, well, in this operational context, it functions merely as a beacon.
Like a signal fire.
Exactly. It's a visual flare in the dark. It's a mechanism designed specifically to attract the attention of a rational mind that is actively seeking warmth and direction.
It's the flashing light on the server tower. It's not the data itself, right? It's just the thing saying, look here.
A perfect analogy. The nar is the beacon. But what Musa goes up the mountain to find is Khabar.
Right.
Khabar translates to news, intelligence, or actionable information. He's expecting a payload. And when he reaches the proximity of the beacon, the text says, Nudia. This translates to, he was called.
Okay.
But the linguistic nuance is vital. This is not a generalized, booming voice echoing across the desert for anyone to hear. Nudia implies a targeted, highly localized address.
It's a secure transmission, point-to-point communication. It's the system saying agent recognized, initiating download.
Yes. And consider where this transmission originates. The text identifies the origin as the blessed spot.
Right, which people always assume means magic dirt.
Exactly. In a theological reading, they assume it means a patch of dirt that is suddenly holy.
Yeah.
But if we are reading this through the hyper-rational lens of the source material, a blessed spot represents a locus of rational authority.
It's a secure node.
It is the centralized node of a structural command. And the way the voice operating from that node introduces itself, well, it's the master stroke of the entire encounter.
Yeah, let's get into that. The voice says, I am Allah, Lord of all the worlds. Let's pause here, because this is where a lot of people's brains automatically default to, the booming guy in the clouds demanding worship.
Oh, constantly.
The traditional reading paints this as a terrifying boast of omnipotence meant to make the human feel small and insignificant. But your sources say that it's a fundamental misreading of the Arabic.
It is a complete misreading. The text uses the phrase Rab Alaminer.
Mm.
We really need to define Rab outside of the medieval feudal concept of a lord or a king.
Okay, so what does it actually mean?
In the linguistic framework of the text, Rab implies the principle of nourishment, development, and evolution. It is the active force that takes an entity from its most basic initial state and gradually, systematically brings it to its ultimate perfection or completion.
So it's like the mechanism that takes a microscopic acorn and provides the nutrients, the water, and the sunlight required over decades to turn it into a massive oak tree.
Yes.
Or the system that takes a single biological cell and guides its division until it becomes a fully functioning human being.
Precisely. Now expand that to Alameen, all the worlds, all the domains of existence.
Wow.
The voice is identifying itself as the governing operating system of the entire universe. It is saying, I am the overarching authority that oversees the nourishment, the evolution, and the critical feedback loops of the cosmos.
Okay, so this isn't a king demanding a peasant to bow.
Not at all. This is the central system identifying itself to the operative it is about to deploy. It's a structural identification.
And that completely flips the psychology of the moment. I mean, think about being in Musa's shoes. You are isolated in a hostile, freezing environment. A voice speaks out of nowhere.
Yeah, that would be terrifying.
Right. The default biological reaction is adrenaline. It's panic, the fight-or-flight response. But by introducing itself as the Rab, the very system that nourishes, sustains, and evolves life, the voice is actively disarming that panic.
It establishes an immediate baseline of profound trust. The system knows it cannot download a highly complex civilizational briefing into a mind that is paralyzed by the fight-or-flight response.
Because your brain just shuts off.
Exactly. Fear shuts down the higher cognitive functions. It forces the brain to focus only on immediate physical survival. So by identifying as the sustainer of all domains, the system assures Musa that this communication is not a threat. It is constructive.
It creates the necessary psychological security for him to actually process the kabar, the actionable intelligence he was seeking.
Right.
Okay, so the system has its agent's attention, the credential check is passed, the secure transmission is open, and psychological trust is established.
We're ready for the download.
But this brings us to a massive foundational question that the source material spends a lot of time addressing. Why does this governing system need to send a briefing at all? What the text calls wahi, or revelation.
Yeah, the big question.
Why not just leave human beings alone to figure out how to organize their societies? I mean, we have intellect, we have incredible problem-solving brains. Why does the operating system of the universe need to intervene structurally?
Well, to understand the necessity of wahi, the source material draws a very stark, very brutal contrast between the systemic briefing and the human intellect's reliance on what we call trial and error.
We are very proud of our intellect, though. I mean, we built microchips and sent rovers to Mars. Surely we can figure out how to run a government.
The human intellect is undeniably brilliant when dealing with the physical universe. When we are tasked with conquering matter, inventing the wheel, discovering the principles of agriculture, mapping the genome, splitting the atom, our intellect is supreme.
Because it's objective.
Because the physical world offers objective, immediate feedback. If you build a bridge with faulty math, it collapses immediately. You learn your error, you adjust your trial, and you build a better bridge. But the socioeconomic sphere operates entirely differently.
Right, because human beings aren't steel beams. We have self-interest.
Exactly. When it comes to organizing human society, when we have to answer the fundamental questions of what is fair, what is just, and who has the right to the resources of the earth, human intellect relies on subjective philosophizing.
And subjective philosophy is always deeply contaminated by the self-interest of whoever holds power.
Always. We didn't solve societal organization the way we solve mathematics. We used trial and error.
Yeah.
And that trial and error cost humanity 6,000 years of recorded blood.
The long, agonizing road.
Millennia of agonizing systemic suffering. We tried the divine right of kings, where one family hoarded all the wealth because they claimed the gods ordained it. The result, mass starvation and trenches of fire.
Yeah.
We tried brutal oligarchies. We tried dictatorships. We tried violent revolutions that just replaced one set of tyrants with another. We tried unregulated, hyper-exploitative capitalism, and we tried authoritarian communism.
We really tried it all.
We spent 6,000 years stumbling through a dark room full of sharp objects, just bleeding out as a species, just to arrive at the somewhat flawed, fragile concepts of modern democracy and basic human rights we hold today.
I want to bring in a brilliant analogy from the source material here because it crystallizes this perfectly. Imagine the entirety of human civilization is a student sitting in an exam room trying to solve a highly complex, incredibly difficult mathematics problem that determines their survival.
Okay, I like this.
Relying solely on human intellect through trial and error is like forcing that student to invent the entire field of calculus from scratch. They are making 1,000 painful mistakes, erasing the board, starting over, crying out of sheer frustration generation after generation.
That sounds miserable.
But wahi, this systemic briefing from the rational order, is like having the answer key printed at the back of the textbook.
That is the exact mechanism. The source material explicitly uses the phrase that it economizes human effort.
It's a civilizational shortcut. It saves humanity from those multi-generational cycles of trauma by providing the permanent, unchangeable values up front.
Right.
For example, instead of spending thousands of years fighting wars to realize slavery is bad, The answer key provides the objective, absolute principle from day one. No human being has the right to rule over another human being, nor do they have the right to exploit their labor.
And that is the crucial distinction between Wahi and human philosophy.
Yeah.
Wahi is direct, objective knowledge. It bypasses the tyranny of unproven assertions. Look at how human society functions without it.
It's chaos.
When we rely solely on our own intellect for social organization, the strong invariably rationalize their exploitation of the weak. The intellect is a tool and will build a justification for whatever the ego desires.
Wow.
If an oligarchy wants to hoard the wealth of a nation, their intellect will invent an economic theory that proves they deserve it. If an emperor wants to conquer his neighbors, his intellect will invent a philosophy that glorifies conquest.
And because it's just human philosophy, it's inherently subjective. I mean, the oppressed person has their own philosophy, but they don't have the power to enforce it. It just becomes a battle of whose philosophical rationalization has the biggest army.
Precisely.
Wow.
Wahi cuts through that subjective warfare. It establishes a baseline metric for human rights that is entirely objective and external to human greed. It cannot be bought, and it cannot be altered to suit the ruling class.
Right.
The permanent values contained in the briefing apply equally to the king, the president, the billionaire CEO, and the lowest paid worker.
Oh.
The answer does not change with the shifting winds of human rationalization or market forces.
So I have to ask, what happens to a civilization that looks at the answer key and says, thanks, but no thanks, we're going to figure this out on our own. We prefer our own philosophies.
The historical record is the answer to that question. A civilization that ignores the objective, permanent values of justice and equity inevitably builds an exploitative system. It cannot help itself.
Because the ego takes over.
Yes. The strong consolidate power. They hoard the resources. They rewrite the laws to protect their hoarding. This creates immense friction and inequality. The masses at the bottom are squeezed tighter and tighter until the system can no longer bear the pressure.
Which leads to collapse.
It leads to violent revolution, societal collapse, and the agonizing process of starting the trial and error all over again from the ashes. The systemic briefing is offered specifically to break humanity out of that destructive loop.
Okay, this brings us to a really fascinating pivot. Because if Wahi is this supreme civilizational shortcut, this objective blueprint for survival, who gets selected to receive it?
That's the core question of recruitment.
Right. Because if we look at our modern cultural archetypes, if we look at movies or popular literature, the people who receive divine wisdom are almost always depicted as ascetics. They're monks, they're mystics.
Absolutely.
The image is someone retreating to a cave high in the Himalayas, starving themselves, meditating in total silence for 20 years, and completely detaching from the messy reality of the world to achieve enlightenment. Does the source material support that kind of profile for its agents?
The source material does not just fail to support that profile, it violently rejects it.
Really?
Yes. The concepts you are describing, often referred to in mystical traditions as kash or ilham, imply gaining profound, hidden knowledge through self-isolation, monasticism, or sensory deprivation. That entire framework is completely alien to the systems engineering narrative of this text.
So they aren't meditating on a mountaintop.
The prophets, the operatives of this system, are not meditating monks. They're not gurus sitting cross-legged on a cloud.
If they aren't achieving some Zen state of detachment, how does a person get chosen to carry a payload that dictates the socioeconomic reorganization of an empire?
We have to introduce a vital linguistic concept here, the concept of fitna.
Fitna. Okay, I've heard that word thrown around a lot. Usually it's translated as chaos, temptation, or social unrest, like, don't cause fitna.
That is how the word has devolved in common everyday parlance. But we are doing a deep dive into the foundational roots of the language. The foundational literal meaning of fitna comes from metallurgy.
Wait, like working with metals?
Exactly. It is the highly rigorous, violent process of putting raw, unrefined gold ore into a blazing, high-temperature blast furnace.
So you apply intense heat to melt it down.
You melt it down to forcefully separate the pure gold from the dross, the slag, the impurities, and the dirt. The heat burns away everything that is weak or non-essential, leaving only the structurally sound element.
Wow.
When the text refers to Musa going through fitna, it is stating unequivocally that he was forged in the furnace of real-world, high-stakes socioeconomic struggle.
Oh.
He was not forged in the quiet safety of a monastery.
Let's trace his specific backstory to see how that furnace actually operated, because Musa wasn't just a guy who lived in the desert his whole life.
No, he had a very specific upbringing.
He grew up inside the belly of the beast. He was raised inside Pharaoh's palace. He had a front row seat to the ultimate command economy. He saw the systemic exploitation of the underclass up close, day in and day out.
He knew exactly how the machine worked.
Right. But crucially, he didn't just meditate on the injustice. He didn't write a sad poem about it. He actively intervened.
And that intervention is the key to his psychological profile.
The texts tell us he saw an Egyptian overseer brutally beating an Israelite slave. When Musa didn't stand back, he stepped in physically to stop the injustice.
He took action.
But that action went terribly wrong. The overseer died. And it instantly made Musa a wanted man. It made him a fugitive. He lost his royal status, his comfort, his safety, all in a fraction of a second because he could not tolerate the sight of unchecked exploitation.
And that reaction is exactly what the overarching system is looking for. Later in the encounter, the system declares, "I have chosen you for myself." I want to be very clear, that choice was not arbitrary.
It wasn't a random lottery.
The system did not draw his name out of a hat. The overarching rational order had been observing Musa's character, his baseline reactions to injustice, over years of active engagement in a deeply corrupt society.
He proved his structural integrity.
He was structurally sound enough to carry the heavy, dangerous payload of the mission briefing precisely because he had engaged with the harsh realities of the world rather than retreating from them.
He stress-tested his own character in the furnace of reality. He proved he wasn't fragile. It makes total sense. I mean, you can't hand the blueprints for a civilizational revolution to someone whose only achievement in life is sitting quietly in a room for 10 years, completely insulated from human suffering.
No, you need someone who knows exactly how heavy the chains are.
But we have to add a layer here, right? Because physical courage and moral endurance, while absolutely necessary, are not sufficient on their own.
Right, there's an intellectual component.
The agent must also possess a highly specific intellectual and psychological state. They cannot just be brave. They must possess a profound, agonizing dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Which leads us to one of the most powerful paradigm shifts in our source material. To unpack this intellectual state, the analysis shifts slightly to a phrase from a different part of the text, Surah Ad-Duha.
Okay, let's look at that.
The phrase is, "Wa wanadaka dalan fahada." Now, if you pick up a standard translation, dalan is almost universally translated as astray or lost.
Yeah, the translation usually reads, "He found you lost and guided you."
Right. It gives the impression that the person was just wandering around aimlessly, maybe making some bad life choices, and the system swooped in to put them on the right path.
Which is an incredibly poor, passive, and frankly insulting translation of the psychological reality the text is describing.
It totally misses the mark.
The source material redefines Dalan based on its deeper linguistic roots and the context of an operative's mindset. Dalan describes a state of intense, consuming, almost painful intellectual restlessness.
It's an active state, not a passive one.
Exactly. It is the psychological state of a brilliant individual who is desperately searching for the ultimate truth. They are looking at the society around them, the inequality, the lies, the exploitation, and they are absolutely refusing to accept the societal default.
I love this reframing. It's not being lost because you dropped your map and don't know where you are.
No.
It's being restless because you know exactly where you are. You realize the place is fundamentally broken, but you haven't yet found the structural solution to fix it. You are agonizing over the problem.
Precisely. The mind of the operative is in a state of high alert inquiry. And to illustrate the gravity of this mindset, the source material brings in a pivotal, brilliant quote from the 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead.
Oh, this is a great connection.
Whitehead wrote something that perfectly captures the opposite of Dalan. He wrote, "The keynote of idolatry is contentment with the prevalent gods."
Contentment with the prevalent gods. Let's just sit with that for a minute because it is a massive statement. We need to dissect it.
We really do.
Because when we hear the word idolatry, our minds immediately go to ancient history. We picture people in tunics bowing down to stone statues of rain gods or sun gods or carving golden calves.
We think of it as a primitive religious error,
which allows modern people to think they are immune to it. But if we connect Whitehead's concept to the bigger picture of our socioeconomic analysis, idolatry has nothing to do with stone statues.
Right.
Idolatry is intellectual stagnation. It is the passive, unthinking acceptance of a broken, exploitative system without ever questioning its underlying premises. The prevalent gods are the dominant ideologies, the unquestioned rules of the day.
So if we translate that into modern terms, the prevalent gods aren't Zeus or Apollo. The prevalent gods are greed, hierarchy.
Exactly.
The unspoken idea that some people are inherently born to rule, and millions of others are born merely to serve as cogs in a machine. The prevalent god is the economic theory that demands mass collateral damage like poverty, homelessness, environmental destruction as an acceptable price for growth.
Yes. The prevalent gods are the invisible systemic rules that everyone around you just accepts as the way things are. To look at a system that crushes human potential and say, well, that's just the economy, there's nothing we can do, to be content with that, that is idolatry.
Wow.
It is bowing down to the status quo. It is worshiping the machinery of exploitation. Therefore, the target audience for a systemic mission briefing, the specific type of mind that receives wahi, must be an individual who is deeply, viscerally agonizing over this exploitation.
They're the ones who feel deeply isolated. I mean, you can imagine the psychological toll. They look at the societal machinery, they see it grinding people to dust, and while everyone else is going to work and paying their taxes and accepting the prevalent gods, this individual absolutely refuses to bow down.
They are the anomaly in the system.
They are the glitch that refuses to conform.
And the text makes a definitive rule here. Wahi, the supreme objective intelligence briefing, only comes to a mind that is already in a state of operational restlessness.
It has to have an open port.
Exactly. The system does not waste its payload on someone who is perfectly happy and comfortable with the way the world is. It does not speak to the complacent. It speaks to the mind that is pacing the floor at night, saying, this cannot be all there is. There has to be a structural, objective solution to this suffering.
Okay, so the system has found its restless mind. The agent has survived the furnace of fitna. The briefing has been securely transmitted. This raises the most important question of all. What is the actual deployment?
What's the mission?
Right. Once you have the answer key, what do you do with it? It is time to move against the target.
And the target, in this case study, is explicitly named and analyzed. It is Pharaoh's system. But again, the text uses a very specific, highly engineered word to describe Pharaoh's governing order. It doesn't just call him a bad king.
No, it uses a specific term.
It calls his system Tuyin.
Tuyin. Let's break down the mechanics of that word.
Tuyin is a brilliant systems engineering term. It implies a state of affairs that has crossed all natural, rational limits. The foundational root of the word is used in Arabic to describe a devastating flood.
Okay.
Picture a massive river that has violently broken its banks, overwhelmed its natural boundaries, and is actively, ruthlessly destroying the surrounding ecosystem that relies on it.
So it's not just a government with high taxes or a flawed bureaucracy. It is a system that has mutated into an existential threat to the very environment it exists in.
It is a runaway train.
It's cancer cells ignoring the body's natural limits and consuming the host.
Cancer is a highly apt analogy. And here we must introduce the embedded underlying logic of the universe, according to the text. The law of requital, or mukafat i'amal.
What does that mean exactly?
This is the principle that every action, especially at a civilizational level, has a strict structural consequence. Egypt's ruling order, the system of Pharaoh, has done something fatal to itself. It has insulated itself from all corrective feedback.
Let's unpack the concept of feedback loops because they are essential to the survival of absolutely any system. Whether we are talking about a biological body, a massive multinational corporation, or a national government.
You need them to survive.
In biology, pain is a negative feedback loop. If you touch a hot stove, the pain receptors send an immediate signal to your brain saying, pull your hand back or you will be destroyed.
Right.
If you don't feel pain, like in the case of leprosy, which destroys nerve endings, you don't pull your hand back. You leave it on the stove until the limb is gone. The lack of negative feedback destroys the organism.
That is precisely how societal feedback loops work. A healthy society requires negative feedback to correct its course. It needs the voices of the marginalized, it needs dissent, it needs accurate data about the suffering of its people to realize its policies are failing.
But Pharaoh's system didn't have that.
Not at all. Through absolute tyranny, through the brutal enforcement of slavery, and through the carefully constructed illusion of his own divine infallibility, he systematically silenced all opposition. He murdered the pain receptors of his own society.
The elites at the top hear only what they want to hear. They live in an echo chamber of their own design, completely insulated from the agony of the slaves building their monuments. They have disabled their internal correction mechanisms.
And in the rational order of the universe, there is a terrifying consequence to that arrogance. When a massive system disables its internal correction mechanisms, it doesn't just get to live forever in a state of taikun.
Something has to give.
The overarching system generates an external correction.
And this is the moment where the puzzle pieces lock together. Musa is not being sent back to Egypt to perform magic tricks to awe the masses or to show off. His deployment is the consequence.
What is truly fascinating here, what strips away the last remnants of the mythological reading, is the nature of the consequence. The consequence of Pharaoh's tyranny isn't a magical lightning bolt falling from the sky to strike him dead.
The universe doesn't operate on cheap theatricality.
Exactly. The consequence is sent in the form of a fully briefed, operational human agent. Musa is the physical, living embodiment of the law of requital. He is the overarching system routing a massive external correction toward a structure that has blinded itself.
He is the negative feedback loop arriving at the palace doors. So what does this all mean in practical, on-the-ground terms? When he walks through those doors, what is the ultimate socioeconomic goal of his mission?
The text doesn't leave this vague.
It gives us a precise programmatic phrase. لِتُجَاكُلُ نَفْسٍ بِمَا.
This is the core payload of the briefing. It is the absolute antithesis of Pharaoh's system. It translates to so that every single person is fully recompensed for their labor.
Fair recompense for labor. That is the objective. That is an economic mandate, not a religious ritual.
It's pure economics.
He isn't sent to tell them to pray differently. He is sent to completely dismantle an exploitative economy where the elites at the top hoard the massive wealth generated by the bleeding workers at the bottom.
It is the ultimate anti-exploitation directive. Pharaoh's system is built on the extreme end of an economy where effort and reward have been completely violently disconnected.
Right.
The elites do zero physical labor, yet they reap 100% of the rewards. The enslaved masses do all the grueling labor, yet they receive nothing but bare subsistence, just enough calories to keep them working the next day.
Just keeping the machine running.
The operational goal of the agent, the reason he was given the answer key, is to restore the balance of cause and effect in the economic sphere. The permanent value is that every soul must receive the exact equivalent of its effort. No hoarding, no exploitation.
To bring this entirely full circle, there is one final linguistic detail from the source material regarding the briefing on the mountain that just blew my mind.
Oh, the valley.
Yeah. When the system is communicating with Musa, it tells him he is in the sacred valley of Tua. Earlier, we established that sacred in this context means a place of rational authority, a secure node. But the word Tua itself, what does it literally mean in the root Arabic?
The literal translation of Tua is to fold up.
To fold up, like rolling up a map when you found your destination, or folding up a blueprint because the building is about to start?
Exactly. Think about the profound psychological resonance of that word from Musa. The system is speaking directly to his condition as Dalan, the restless, agonizing wanderer.
Right.
It is telling him, your long, brutal journeys, your years of surviving the furnace of fitna, your aimless, restless searching for the truth of how to fix this broken world, that era is now folded up. It is complete.
The text also tells him to take off his shoes in this valley. Now, universally, people read that and say, oh, take off your shoes because the ground is holy, show some respect, don't get dirt on the magic mountain. But if we are reading this in a purely operational context.
In an operational context, shoes, especially for a desert traveler, are the primary tool of the journey. Taking off the traveling shoes means the journey of searching is over.
The search is done.
You have arrived at the destination of your inquiry. You sought Kabar, and you have received the intelligence. You have the objective briefing. The era of wandering in the dark is folded up. Now it is time to put on the boots of execution. The mission begins.
It is such a staggeringly powerful synthesis of a narrative. When you apply this socioeconomic rational lens, it completely strips away all the fairy dust. It reveals a meticulously engineered blueprint for dismantling tyranny.
If we synthesize this entire deep dive, what emerges is a brilliant, dynamic interaction between permanence and change. The permanent, unchangeable principle is that the rational order of the universe, the governing system, does not announce itself through theatrical supernatural spectacle.
Feel efficient for that.
Right. It does not demand blind, terrified worship. It announces itself by assigning a precise, high-difficulty, evidence-based mission to a receptive, intellectually restless intelligence.
That is the permanence. The requirement for justice, the mandate against exploitation, the necessity of the restless mind, that never changes. And the change.
The change is that the specifics of the oppression evolve.
Yeah.
Every era, every generation generates its own fire on the mountain.
I want to focus on that because we don't have pharaohs building pyramids with whip-cracking overseers today, but we have our own versions of Tugyan.
We absolutely do. Every era produces an anomaly that the current corrupt system cannot explain or control. A massive crisis of extreme wealth inequality, a systemic failure of justice, a breakdown in the socioeconomic machinery where millions are left behind while a few hoard the resources.
Yeah.
The anomaly is always there, burning on the periphery of our vision, signaling that the system has disabled its feedback loops.
And so we have to turn this lens on you, the listener. We have to ask you to look at this ancient text not as a history lesson, but as a mirror. In just 2 short, highly concentrated verses, a text that is thousands of years old meticulously documents the crossing of an individual.
A profound crossing.
He goes from being a wandering, isolated, frustrated fugitive to a commissioned operational agent of civilizational survival.
It forces every single one of us to examine our own cognitive frameworks.
Which brings me back to the philosopher Whitehead and that haunting concept of idolatry as a contentment with the prevalent gods. I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day.
It's a heavy thought.
If idolatry is accepting the socioeconomic status quo without question, what are the invisible prevalent gods of our modern algorithmic age? What are the massive systems today, the tech monopolies, the financial institutions, the political echo chambers that have totally insulated themselves from corrective feedback, assuming they're simply too big to fail?
It's the most vital question we can ask.
Yeah.
Are we blindly trusting the system? Are we bowing to the prevalent gods of convenience, of automated exploitation, of a completely disconnected gig economy?
Or are we actively looking out into the dark for our own fire on the mountain? Are we agonizing over the glitches that prove the system is fundamentally broken? Because the real question isn't whether the fire will appear. The fire always appears when a system crosses its limits.
Every single time.
The question is, if the anomaly appeared today right in front of you, illuminating the dark, would you respond with the operational instinct of Musa and say, I will go and bring back actionable intelligence, or would you just dismiss it as a glitch in the matrix, pull your coat a little tighter, and choose to stay in the cold?